Hi everyone. Last time we talked about GDP and talked how to calculate GDP, right? So this time we are going to talk something about economic growth, or more particularly, that refers to GDP growth. Right? So this figure shows us the average GDP per capita in the world over a very long time period, like since 1,000 years ago. So you can see that the rapid and sustained economic growth is a very recent experience compared to the whole human history, right? So that only happens in the last 2 or 3 centuries. And nowadays, most people believe that it starts from the Industrial Revolution. And you should know about the Industrial Revolution, right? That refers to the increase in production brought about by machines and characterized by new energy sources. So the Industrial Revolution began around 1750s and started in Great Britain and then spread to other countries in, like US, Germany, and other countries. So if you see this figure here, you can see that the GDP per capita started taking off like the earliest in the Western Europe, and then the US, Japan, Eastern Europe, and the rest of the world, right? So that's the spread of the Industrial Revolution and economic growth. And this modern economic growth like totally changed the human society and shaped our modern lives in basically in every perspective, right? So if you can see the whole population in the world that follows a very similar pattern with the GDP. So before the Industrial Revolution of the human history, our total populations like kept a very stable and flat pattern, right? And only after the Industrial Revolution, we have higher productivity. We can produce more food, more good, and to raise more people. Only after then, our population started to increase like a lot, right? So in the last 2 or 3 centuries, our population totally took off, and nowadays it's almost 7 billions, right? And and also this industrial revolution like totally created the industry, right? So people started leaving the agriculture sector and coming to work in the industry sector, right? So this figure shows this, we call that structural change, right? So before like 200 years ago, majority of the population in the US, they were working in the agricultural sector, right? So now after that, people started leaving the agriculture sector and work in the industry and the service sector. So you can see that the decline in the employment share in the agriculture. So nowadays in the US, there is only less than 2% of population working in the agriculture sector, right? So you can also see the similar pattern in Japan. And also as people leaving the agriculture sector and coming to work in the industry sector, that means they will come into the cities and live in the cities. And then new cities were built and cities are also expanding, and there were more and more people living in the cities, and we call that process urbanization, right? So that's measured by the share of population living in urbanized areas. We can see that share also follows a very similar pattern than with our GDP figure and the population figure, right? After the Industrial Revolution, there were more people coming to the cities and work in the industry, right? So our urbanization rate like increased a lot in the last 200 years. Also, the Industrial Revolution created very new industries and changed our pattern of energy consumptions, right? So in very ancient time, people mainly uses the traditional biofuels, right? After we now we created machines, and machines started to use coals and crude oil and natural gas, and more recently we started to use the wind, solar, and nuclear powers, right? And if we investigate the whole total energy consumption, you can see that pattern is also very similar. Like the total consumption is quite flat before, and after the Industrial Revolution, that started taking off and increased a lot. So what's the economic growth like in the US? Actually, for the nearly 150 years, the GDP per capita in the US has grown like a remarkably steady average rate of 2% each year. So you can see the figure here. So the red dashed line shows the value if with a steady 2% increase each year, and the blue line is the GDP per capita in the US. So these two lines like align with each other very well, right? And you can only see there are some fluctuations around the Great Depression and World War II. And other than that, it's very similar, right? So the takeaway here is that the US GDP has been growing at a 2%, around 2%, like for a very long period. That's really remarkable. So how can we get this GDP growth rate? So basically this growth rate is a change rate, right, from year to year. How to calculate that? From year 1 to year 2, we just use the value in year 2 minus the value in year 1 and divided that by the GDP value in year 1. So for example, the US GDP per capita in 2023 is around $67,000, and that value in 2022 is around $65,000, right? So the growth rate from 2022 to 2023 is given by the value in 2023, which is around $67,000, minus the value in 2022, which is $65,000, right? Divided by the value in 2022, and we got that number is around 2.6%. Right? How can we interpret this 2% growth rate? So it's a compound growth rate. So right, so it's like a bank account. Each year will build on growth from the previous year, right? So a 2% growth each year for 10 years is not necessary to be equal to 20% increase. It's not, right? Because it's compound, and the growth in next year is built based on the previous year. So we start from 100 and keep growing at a rate of 2% every year. After 10 years, actually, we got something more than 20%, right? That's because the compound growth. So that's 10 years. How about 150 years, like the US history of economic growth? That's not a 300 increase, right? The number actually is very large, incredibly large. So if we keep calculating year by year and iterate that for 150 times, we got a number of almost 20 times, which means if we keep growing at a rate of 2% each year, after 150 years, our economy will become like 20 times larger than before, right? So it's almost 2,000%. Very different compared to 300%. So that means each person now living in the US is producing and so consuming like 19 times more than people lived in 150 years ago, right? So the economic growth totally changed our life. Here is a rule of 70, which we can use that to calculate the doubling time. So which means we can use that to calculate how long it takes for the economy to double in size. So that time or number of years will be given by we dividing 70 by the annual growth rate. So for example, for the case of US has a steady growth rate of 2% each year. So which means it will take 35 years to double in size. So the 35 is given by 70, which comes from its rule of 70, divided by 2, which comes from its 2% growth rate. Right? So for the US economy, it takes 35 years to double. How about other countries like China? So nowadays, China has roughly a growth rate of 5% each year, and China needs only 14 years to double in size. That 14 comes from 70, rule of 70 again, over 5 comes from 5%, right? So that's the rule of 70.